Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to The True Connoisseur, my channel where I discuss perfumery as personal experience, as cultural object. And this is the second part of our series on tobacco as a subject in perfumery. In the first part, we discussed broadly how tobacco has come to be represented in the contemporary market, discussing sweeter tobaccos. Sweeter tobaccos with strong gourmand elements, where that's pulling from, how that's been expressed in perfume structures, which are the significant perfumes there. Today, we are talking about a different class of tobacco perfumes, and these are the quote-unquote gentlemanly tobaccos, these sort of throwback tobaccos that are appealing to a bygone era of a more elegant masculinity, primarily of a European sort, right? This image of men in suits or dinner jackets, smoking cigars and pipes, smelling of classic grooming products. This is a fantasy that is sold by fragrance houses many, many times. And it's interesting here, I have a collection of 6 tobacco fragrances that I feel that embody this to one extent or another. There's one that's kind of an outlier here, and we'll talk about that one when we get to it, but I didn't know quite where else to place it in the spectrum of tobacco fragrances. It's interesting that of these 6 fragrances, 4 of them are built around the idea, the mythic idea of Cuba. Now, that would be an association with, a tobacco fragrance is no surprise there. There are plenty of tobacco fragrances that are associated with the idea of Cuba or a Cuban cigar. Cuba is one of the world's foremost producers of tobacco and is widely recognized and praised for its tobacco products. So there's kind of a mythic stature that it has there already when we're talking about tobacco. But it also appeals to this kind of fantasy, and the first of these fragrances that I'm going to talk about here is very strongly rooted in this, the fantasy of pre-Castro Cuba, this sort of decadent time where there was music and dancing and tobacco, and all of this existed in a playground for the rich and famous, and also some of the criminal elements that thrived there in the pre-Castro era. And this is, whether that should be a subject for fantasy or not, it has kind of seeped into the cultural lexicon that way, and fragrances have not stopped building upon that old Havana sort of aura that kind of it holds as a lost moment in time, a sort of period of excess and glamour and of a different kind of wealthy person, right? And so that dovetails very nicely with this also parallel idea of the sort of retro gentleman. And of course, that's been now marketed and repackaged today as, retro masculinity is its own sort of mini industry these days with, retro suits and things like that being sold as an alternative to conventional modern tastes. But let's just get into the fragrances. I digress a bit here. We could talk all day about the way, brands appeal to different facets of the masculine ideal. But the first of these fragrances is a fragrance that is near and dear to my heart. I have talked about it many times. It is now seemingly discontinued. Certainly prices have risen, though it's always hard to tell with this collection. And that is Aramis Havana from Estee Lauder. This is a very old school masculine in the style, mostly of a kind of the 80s. It came out in the mid-90s, but it was really a throwback to things that had come a little bit before it, and you really feel that in the structure of this. I really think Havana wears best in summertime. People will sometimes say it's a little heavier for this, too heavy for the summer. I disagree. I think this thing really does its best in high heat. Otherwise, I think it skews too green, and you lose a lot of the fantasy here of this fragrance. But Havana, it opens up kind of shockingly sharp and green and punchy, but then you start to get this sort of boozy Cuba Libre sweetness in there. It's sort of boozy, sort of bay rumish, though I wouldn't necessarily say this is a bay rum fragrance in the way that certain fragrances are bay rum fragrances. This isn't quite bay rum, but it kind of has that vibe, and it's so, the way I think of it is like if you were in the Havana of, like, say, Graham Greene's time, and, you know, you were in the courtyard of an old Havana hotel. It's a little run down. It's not the most glamorous hotel in Havana, but it's there. There's a lot of greenery in the courtyard to help, you know, fill in the space. And you're there and you're sipping your Cuba Libre, and it's late afternoon. And as the sun sets, you finally go out to a club where there's music and dancing and partying. And that's kind of the journey you get with Havana. It opens up cool and dark and green, and then the sort of Cuba Libre rum and coke feeling starts to come to the forefront with that tobacco starting to creep in. You're enjoying the cigar with your drink, and then it really comes down to this sweet, spicy dry down, especially in the more recent formulations. The older ones are very close to this. You don't really need an older bottle of Havana, but the older ones do skew more in that oak mossy, slightly tinged dry down, a little bit more of its time. So if that is a must-have for you, by all means, seek out a vintage bottle. Otherwise, the current smells excellent, and I really like how the sweeter dry down works out here. The tobacco is very much a classic tobacco note. A little bit ashy, but again, this isn't aggressively tobacco forward. The tobacco is really one of many elements at play in Havana. And I love this. I think it holds up well. It's a gorgeous summertime fragrance. I wear it a little less than I used to, but it is still a delight. And the reason I wear it a little less than I used to is because of it just has more competition in my collection these days, such as Czech and Speake Cuba, the eau de parfum. There was originally, I think it was the eau de cologne originally, but now it's issued in an eau de parfum concentration. This is a much more single-minded treatment of the theme that you get from Aramis Havana. It's a lot, let's see, it's less rum and coke and more mojito. You get a lot of mint off the top, with some kind of slight civet. This is a more polarizing fragrance than Havana. This has a bit of retro style animalic tone to its opening. So you get this sort of mint, a little bit of civet, this sort of boozy rum quality alongside cedar, a tobacco accord that really appears in the opening. It's a very smoky, dark tobacco accord, but it kind of fades out. Like, the opening of this is very pungent, then it becomes a much more woody bay rum-ish scent with a little bit of frankincense peeking out behind the cedar and things like that. It's a lot more mellow after the opening 30 minutes, but the opening 30 minutes can be a little bit punchy with that civet and the mint playing together alongside this sort of boozy rum facet and this kind of raw tobacco. The tobacco accord kind of breaks down pretty quickly. It's not like you get lots and lots of tobacco in this fragrance. It's really nice. Again, these are kind of cousins. These are siblings, cousins in a regard. This is the more complex and polished fragrance, but this has a sort of like robust directness that I really like. And the mint note in this is really, if you like actual mint leaf, this is one of the best mint notes I've found in a fragrance. It really feels like you just kind of muddled some mint in a glass for your cocktail. It's really nice, and I find that very refreshing in summertime. So I enjoyed both of these fragrances very, very much. But keeping with the theme, this is one of my all-time favorite tobacco fragrances, and I wear this a lot. In fact, it's my scent of the day. I've talked about this many times. It's Santa Maria Novella Acqua di Cuba. Acqua di Cuba is sadly discontinued. I'm sorry to say, it's still floating around out there. I'm not trying to scare anyone. Lord knows if you're watching this video, you probably don't need another bottle of perfume. So I'm not trying to convince you to get anything, but it is near and dear to my heart. So it is a shame that supplies are dwindling, so to speak, of what is a very unique take on tobacco. Acqua di Cuba is a little sweeter than the two I mentioned before, because there's a very barbershoppy vanilla. Obviously, vanilla has a very well-documented place in sort of conventional masculine perfumery, especially with the fougères of the mid-20th century, where, you know, lavender and tobacco really played strongly together. The vanilla in this is not gourmand, so this is why this doesn't fit in the sweet tobacco category, really. It's one of those sort of like powdery, creamy vanilla undercurrents, right? But really you're getting a lot of very gentlemanly, barbershoppy lemon up top. You get a slightly animalic, very floral honey, and then it's dancing alongside a little bit of cinnamon, and then you're getting one of the best tobacco accords I've encountered in a perfume. It is a little bit acrid and bitter in the way that real tobacco is. It's not a crowd-pleasing tobacco accord. Feels very much like a blonde tobacco leaf from like a cigar of like a more golden hue. It's a gorgeous humidor style tobacco. It makes me think of, you know, smoking a cigar in an immaculate linen suit, and I'm probably an older gentleman with a nice full white beard, and it's sunny outside, and the scent of sweet flowers are coming along the wind alongside the tobacco, which I haven't lit yet, but I'm holding the cigar up to my nose. It's like a very lovely, sunny sort of tobacco fragrance, and again, wears very beautifully in warm weather. It's punchy stuff, but is beautiful. And as we kind of go through this and now to the final and fourth fragrance, it's like all of these fantasias on you know, a retro Cuban atmosphere. Of them all, if the last two make me think of more of like an imagined Cuba, so Czech and Speake Cuba and Aramis Havana make me think of kind of like an imagined fantasy Cuba. I've been to Cuba before. Acqua di Cuba actually brings me back a little bit more to the experience of having been there, having been in a cigar factory where they roll the cigar by hand. This reminds me more of that experience. It triggers some sense memories for me in a way that I really love. This next one is really, really, really good. Though I don't know how much longer I'll actually keep it in my collection, because I don't know that I'll wear it as much as I thought I would when I picked it up. And that is AquaFlor La Habana. I smelled this initially and was very taken by the opening, because what this has is one of the best cigar box accords I have ever encountered. AquaFlor La Habana has this wonderful dry down that is kind of a very woody, sweet tobacco dry down that is just the platonic ideal of like your gentlemanly cigar box, like a grandfather's cigar box that you're kind of going through, and the warm smells of the wood and the tobacco, and maybe just like a hint of your grandfather's cologne or aftershave. Structurally, it's kind of built on the core structure of Caron pour un homme, which is to say it's lavender, vanilla, with a little bit of, you know, that's sort of like doughy vanilla lavender thing going on. It's not as lavender centric as something like Caron pour un homme, but it's very much a fougere with a tobacco accord pretty much prominently in the base. And I love how kind of old school gentlemanly it is. It captures the vibe appropriately. The reason I just don't love it as much as the three I've mentioned is it's just not as dynamic aware. It's kind of, it stays in one lane. It doesn't offer a lot of surprises. It's cigar box accord is beautiful, but I just want a little bit more from it than it gives. So that's AquaFlor La Habana, but it embodies the concept. Now we're moving on to something a little bit more Italian in ambiance. This is Bell'Antonio by Hilde Soliani. Bell'Antonio is really lovely stuff. It's less cigar tobacco than it is startlingly accurate cigarette tobacco smoke. One of the most realistic cigarette tobacco smoke scents that I can recall. But more, again, tobacco impressions in perfumery, as I said in my first video, are often impressions. They are not photorealistic recreations. Real tobacco has a lot of harshness about it, a lot of punchy aspects that not everybody would enjoy. People don't necessarily love the smell of wafting cigar smoke out of the blue, right? Cigarette smoke similarly, but this has the kind of warm, comforting aspects that come from cigarette smoke. So it's cigarette smoke dancing in the air alongside the aromas of roasted coffee beans, and then there's like a green grassy tone supporting it. It's a very simple structure, but this accord doesn't really exist anywhere else, so it really remains pretty fascinating, easy to wear, but is one of the perfumes that I would say of all of these is the one that would probably have somebody maybe thinking you're a smoker if you wear it. So keep that in mind if you're going to seek this out. I love it to pieces, but it is definitely a tobacco lover's tobacco in that regard, and in particular, a cigarette tobacco accord. Next up, we have a fairly unusual fragrance from perfumer Bertrand Duchefort. This is from Eau d'Italie. This is Bois d'Ambry. Bois d'Ambry is a peculiar tobacco, and I wouldn't say it fits in this lane in the same way, but it has this tobacco pouch accord in there, though this is a very profoundly spicy and vegetal scent. It's something I actually love to wear around the time of like American Thanksgiving, because it has a sort of spiced yam, spiced sweet potato kind of feeling to it, very vegetal, very green, with this sort of like leather tobacco pouch feeling in the middle of it. I can't compare it to any other fragrance for you, because I've not smelled anything else like it. It's one of Bertrand Duchefort's most like, this is pretty unusual, but is really pleasant to wear. It actually wears very nicely. It's kind of a beautiful thing, but it is peculiar. But it fits in the same kind of vibe. I mean, there's nothing, it has this sort of gentlemanly posture about it. It feels a little bit more, you know, old suit sort of vibe, country house-ish feeling, autumnal. It's not heavy, but it's warm. Really, really lovely stuff, and I've included it in this category because I'm not sure where it particularly fits, but this is the closest category I can think to put Bois d'Ambre in. Really, really stunning stuff. If you can find it, would be one of my top picks in the genre as a whole. And then finally, here, as an honorable mention, so we've talked about my 6 primaries, and this fragrance, I'm just not sure quite where it fits in the rest of the scheme of things. So I've included in this because it has some of the sort of boozy facets that I associate with the, Aramis Havana and the Czech and Speake Cuba, but it is really doing its own thing. It doesn't quite feel like a suit and tie fragrance, but it has the feeling of maybe being in a comforting attic where there was some tobacco products lingering there and some other memories associated with it that kind of fit it into this sort of gentlemanly, grandfatherly tobacco category, and that is Clandestine Laboratories Orpheus. Orpheus opens up very very citrusy, like a slightly fizzy cola note. I think of it as being a little bit more like the Italian liqueurs known as Amaro, the bitters, which can be very cola-like, but have a very strong herbal facet to it. So they're not sugary, and this isn't sugary either. This is not a sweet soda thing. It is sharp citrus with herbs. And then there's this tobacco accord in the base, this sort of pleasantly musty tobacco. So you're getting this sort of like boozy Amaro and tobacco experience. It's adjacent to what we're talking about here in this sort of retro tobacco vibe. It certainly doesn't feel like it's evoking any sort of contemporary experience. It feels like you're maybe stepping back in time a little bit, but there's no particular historical association that I get with Orpheus. It's just a very pleasant wear, and it has some wonderful presence. So I do love Orpheus, so a nice honorable mention for this category. Not something that it's so unique that doesn't really fit in any delineation that I could make for tobacco fragrances. It just kind of hovers out there on its own as a artisanal take on tobacco that is a one-of-a-kind interpretation by perfumer Mark Sage over at Clandestine Laboratories, but it is really lovely stuff, and I want to shout it out because of that sort of Amaro quality, which doesn't show up in fragrances that often, and I really like that category of Italian liqueur. So there you have it. Those are 7 fragrances here, 6 primarily in the category and 1 sort of honorable mention. So I hope you've enjoyed my little walkthrough through the fragrances I have in this category. Let me know what you think of as being in this category. I know there are more entries that I don't have anymore that seem to fit in this. Certainly there's a whole set of fragrances from the early 2000s that I might say kind of fit a little bit in this style. Something like Baldessarini, the original, feels like it was kind of bridging this sort of old school feeling with like the more contemporary needs of the time, and you kind of saw Baldessarini inform many other fragrances that came out. Vera Wang for men, Tom Ford for men, this kind of thing that kind of picked up steam. You saw that sit there a little bit. I think Versace Man was an interesting release around the same time too, that has this sort of old school vibe without actually leaning into anything particularly old school or particularly notably barbershoppy to do that. There was a I think that category of tobacco scent is kind of adjacent to this one, and I don't have a lot of fragrances in that category that I can talk through in this video. I have owned them over the years, but they've kind of seen their way out of my collection, so I do want to at least tilt my hat in the direction, because I think those are essentially successors to this category. Like, insofar as Aramis Havana has a successor in the 2000s, it kind of enters into that space. The stream of fragrances you get with Baldessarini and Versace Man and things like that, that really we're not yet at the point where the market has gone over to fully sweet, robust, sweet tobacco fragrances, right? That really picks up steam once you start to get Hermes, Ambre Narguilé, and Chergui, and Tobacco Vanille really coming out and really building a strong push towards that sweetness. There was this kind of middle period in the late 90s to the 2000s where you could get things that had tobacco in them but were clean and fresh and still sort of gentlemanly. Even like Creed, Tabaron Millésime, things like that were kind of building off of this sense of a gentlemanly tobacco fragrance. And that's kind of a category that is adjacent to what I've discussed here that deserves a little bit of a mention. So let me know if you like any of the fragrances I've discussed here. Let me know if you have recommendations in this category that I haven't covered. Let me know how you feel about tobacco being used to evoke this sort of retro-masculine ideal. Does it work for you as a fantasy? Does that idea of a lit pipe and cigar evoke any nostalgia for you, or just any sort of nostalgic escapism? I'm very curious. It works to an extent on me. I am much more partial to some of the fragrances that are leaning into other stories, but obviously I've been a big sucker for fragrances that are at least notionally dealing with the aura of Cuba, and that's just because I've been to Cuba and it left such a big impression on my life. So thanks for spending your time with me, and I look forward to reading your comments, and I'll catch you in the next one.